Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
Well, good evening, and welcome to All Saints teach-in on gun violence prevention. My name is Dennis Hernandez. I am the chair of the Gun Violence Task Force for All Saints Church. This teach-in is the third in a series of events hosted by All Saints, and it all around this issue of gun violence prevention. On Saturday, All Saints participated in a gun buyback program. It was a wonderful event, a very symbolic event where we brought together the faith community, the nonprofit community, our community leaders, and Pasadena Police Department to engage in a buyback of guns, take some guns off the street. And I'm happy to report that as a result, we were able to get 135 guns off the streets in Pasadena. Yesterday, we had a forum at the All Saints Forum. We had a speaker, noted author and UCLA professor Adam Winkler, who talked to us about the Second Amendment, what it means and what it doesn't mean. And tonight we're here in this teach-in to share, to learn from each other, to learn from experts about this issue of gun violence prevention and how we can organize as a community. Before I get started, we have a noted guest, Anthony Portantino, who is our representative in the legislature. He has been an advocate for more effective gun laws, and I'd like to ask him to come up and say a few words.
I didn't know I was going to speak, but given an opportunity to speak, what politician ever says no? See, I'm an honest politician. I tell the truth. But this is an important issue. Obviously, we've seen tragedy around our country. We've seen children lose their lives much, much, much too soon. And California has traditionally been a leader in many gun control issues, and hopefully will continue to be at the forefront of this conversation. I was blessed to, over my last 2 years in the legislature, to have carried 2 bills on the open carry of unloaded handguns. And I don't know if you're familiar with that issue, but there was a loophole in California law that said if the gun was unloaded, all other laws didn't apply. So all you had to do, if this was your gun, if you took the bullets out and you put the bullets here, and you had the gun here, you didn't have to follow any of the other gun restrictions. And so what the open carry activists were doing is they would put their clips on their belt, just not in the gun, and they were going to the mall, to Starbucks, what I would call Main Street, California, and they were encouraging all of their members to have an unnecessary proliferation of weapons on Main Street, California. That created several problems, because when the average family would be on Main Street and they'd see 3 people get out of a van with their weapons, they'd call the police. They don't know. And so the police would have to come out to those stops, which A, takes their attention away from something else, and B, would create an unnecessarily tense situation, because now you have a stop, and under federal law, there were limits of what the police officers could and could not ask. They couldn't see if the guns were registered. They couldn't ask where the guns were purchased. All they could ascertain was whether the gun was loaded or not loaded. And so those stops around our state were escalating in tension level. And so the police chiefs actually, and the rank and file law enforcement officers, asked California to close that loophole. And all efforts to close that loophole had failed in prior legislative sessions. So I was able to get that onto the governor's desk 2 years ago, and Governor Jerry Brown signed it with the help of law enforcement. Now, interestingly, when we passed the first bill, we said handguns. We didn't talk about rifles and shotguns. We figured, we're not going to go out into the middle of nowhere and, if there's somebody who's licensed who's going to be doing, a licensed hunting activity, they're not on Main Street, California. Well, lo and behold, the gun enthusiasts started carrying their rifles and shotguns on Main Street, California, and encouraging their members to do so. So much so that they showed up at a police fundraiser at a diner in the Inland Empire and brought all their weapons into the diner just to show their weapons. So we had to carry a second bill to close the open carry of long guns because, again, the folks who pushed that agenda. Now, during this process, I got many, many angry phone calls, angry Facebook posts. One said he'll understand when something happens to his family. A guy stalked me outside of the Capitol with his video for 20 minutes and followed me around, peppering me with questions. Just last week, somebody, Facebook bombed me, got on my Facebook and did all kinds of angry posts calling me all kinds of un-American type things because I pushed what I think was a very common sense, sensible piece of legislation. I tell you that because, unfortunately, there's a line in the sand that reasonable minds on the other side won't cross. And that's what is so disconcerting to me. I mean, background checks. 90% of America supports the background checks, but yet we could not get that through and onto the president's desk. And so there is a sweet spot for common sense solutions. We just need the grassroots advocacy, and obviously tonight I'm preaching to the choir, and All Saints has been such a leader in California, has been a leader, but there's more to do. There was a bill last year that there's a way to turn a non-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon, and there was a bill to close that loophole, and it died in California. So that was a bill supported by Democratic senators that died in the democratically controlled assembly. Hopefully it comes back this year, and that loophole of turning unautomatic into automatic weapons can be closed. So thank you for being out tonight, and thank you All Saints for being such leaders on this issue. If you go to Facebook, you can actually see they took the gunfight from the movie Heat, and they intercut Val Kilmer shooting machine guns with my face on Facebook. Excuse me, on YouTube. And you can see, and then they drew the Joker's mask on my face and have Sinister laughing. So they try to intimidate. They try to send a message. They try to scare you off. But obviously, knowing that our district is so supportive gives all of us the confidence. So don't be shy with your elected representatives. Make sure that they know where your heart is and where the heart and minds of California are, and we'll continue to fight this battle. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. We really appreciate all you're doing. So let me give you a little context of what we're doing here. After the events at Sandy Hook Elementary School, the All Saints community came together and in a listening session to share thoughts and emotions, but most of all, to explore what can we do next. And what came out of that listening session was a consensus that we wanted an organized effort. What Reverend Bacon refers to as sustained action. And as a result of that, the Gun Violence Task Force was formed. We've been working diligently to put these events together, and we're trying to determine and decide what are the next steps. And part of what we're going to explore tonight and what we want your input on is let's decide what we can do to continue the effort to move our agenda forward to find sustained action around this issue of gun violence prevention. So our objectives on this teaching tonight are, one, to arm you, I like arm as a metaphor, to arm you with knowledge and information so that you can engage the issues intelligently and thoughtfully, to encourage you to become active participants. Here at All Saints, in some of the organized efforts nationally, like the Brady Campaign or Organizing for America, there's a lot of things going on. Find a way to get involved and get involved. That's our message tonight. And then, thirdly, as I said, to help us in our All Saints effort for sustained action. Over here are the couple tables. These are our action tables, and we encourage you to stop by the action table. There is a sheet there. We'd like to know who you are, how do we get in touch with you. We're going to keep you informed to the extent that we can of what our activities are, and then find ways to engage your resources and your energy in a meaningful way. There's also another thing at the action table which we'd like you to stop and look at, and that's the California Life Act. There are a series of bills that are currently winding their way through the legislature. Assemblyman Portantino has been actively involved in moving our agenda. California has some of the strongest laws, but we really should be a leader in showing that these laws work, they're effective, and they can reduce gun violence in our state. So please stop by the action table and take a look at the Life Act. And there's some letters that you can send to your members of the legislature. So now this is going to be a session. We have a special guest, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kaile Schilling. Kaile is the executive director of the Violence Prevention Coalition of Greater Los Angeles. The Violence Prevention Coalition does training and workshops in violence prevention, and they're really known for their work in gang intervention and gang violence prevention. So we're really proud of her. She is a regular contributor to the Huffington Post. She has a degree in social anthropology from Harvard and a master's in theological studies from my alma mater, Loyola Marymount. Thank you, Kaile.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you for having me. It is such a privilege to be here. And I want to thank all of you for being here as well. Excuse me. This isn't an easy issue to engage with. As you heard from Assemblymember Portantino, people don't like to engage in it. It often riles tempers and gets you in trouble. So this is a courageous act, and thank you all for being here and being willing to really wrestle with it. Yeah, I am Kaile Schilling. The Violence Prevention Coalition, just to let you know a little bit about who we are, we're a coalition, a network of over 90 organizations across Los Angeles County, and we were founded on the premise that violence can be prevented and prevented effectively when we talk about it as an issue of public health and not just an issue of criminal justice. This is particularly true with gun violence. With gun violence killing between 80 to 90 people each day in this country, it's the second leading cause of death among young men in Los Angeles County. It's safe to say that gun violence is, in fact, an epidemic. Imagine if this were a disease killing our young people at that rate, and imagine what our responses would be. I imagine it'd be pretty different than what we're seeing right now. So what does this mean? I know all of you are here tonight to learn a little something, and hopefully we'll give you some tools to talk about gun violence and violence prevention as a public health issue. So here we go, compressed into 2 easy concepts. Hopefully easy. The first thing that really reframes this is to change the question that we ask. It means we stop asking, how do we respond to violence? That would be law enforcement, incarceration, hospitals. And we start asking, what causes violence? So how do we address the cause instead of investing only in better responses? Again, if you think of the disease metaphor, if you try to quarantine your way out of the problem without turning to vaccines, you're not going to get very far. So if guns, in public health language, are the mosquitoes that carry the virus of violence, then gun laws, you can see them as the mosquito nets. They're part of a comprehensive approach If we're going to compare to malaria again, we're going to use vaccines and clean water and treatment, but we are going to use those mosquito nets because that's an important way to interrupt the transmission of violence. So we can see gun laws in the same way. To those who say gun laws have no effect, we have research that says of the 10 states with the strongest gun safety legislation, 7 have the lowest rates of gun homicides. It's not just about homicides, though. This is something that gets left out of the conversation a lot. More than half the young people who commit suicide with a firearm got that gun from their house. So gun violence is not just in our streets, it is also something that is impacting our young people. So the second thing that forms the basis of seeing violence as a public health issue is to stop focusing on individuals. And we start looking at the neighborhoods, the communities, and the systems that these individuals live in. In other words, we don't rely exclusively on people to make the best choices. It didn't work with motor vehicle safety. It didn't work with smoking. These are 2 of the most successful public health campaigns in recent history. Yes, of course, we have to address individual behavior and ask for individual responsibility. But we also have to change the systems and the laws to encourage people to wear seatbelts, to ban smoking in airplanes and restaurants. We have to stop blaming and say that somehow if every person just behaved properly, then the system would work. Instead of actually asking, how do we make the system work in spite of people who might make some bad choices? This is actually something that makes me furious when we get into the gun debate. Every time there's an incident of gun violence, we are asked to blame the individual. It's a mental health issue. That person was crazy. There was some extenuating circumstance. And I'm going to tell you, every time you hear that, you are being sold a bill of goods. Because what it says is you're going to be distracted by looking at the individual so that you don't examine a system that is failing. Gun laws alone will not solve the epidemic of gun violence, but they are a critical component of the systems change that's required. Now, when we talk about the public health approach, part of that is also changing cultural norms. This comes back to smoking and seatbelts. I was speaking at the Empowerment Summit a while back, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and she said her son was watching Grease. Olivia Newton-John, John Travolta. And she said her son came up to her afterwards and he said, "Mom, everyone in that movie was smoking all the time, and nobody wore seatbelts. What was up with that?" That's the public health approach. Cultural norms changed. They changed in a lifetime. So now here's where those who are in favor of unlimited guns have been very successful. There is a very deeply entrenched story being told out there about guns. Here, I'm going to show you a little bit of that. We're changing the norms about smoking. You know how the story goes. The story goes, guns will make us safe. The only thing that will stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. We've all heard this story, right? But what we know from a school in Connecticut to a shopping mall in Tucson to a schoolyard in Stockton is that that's not true. What stops a bad guy with a gun is not a good guy with a gun, but the fact that the bad guy ran out of bullets. What stops people from being shot is having fewer weapons to shoot with. But this story that guns will make us safe, it continues. We're told we need them in our homes to protect us. The story is convincing, but the facts tell a different story. For every time a gun is used in the home in self-defense, it is used 22 times in an accidental shooting, in a suicide, or against the homeowner. Right? This is more dangerous in your home than having somebody break into it. An abused woman is 5 times more likely to be killed by her abuser if there is access to a gun, even if that gun is the one that she bought to protect herself. Guns hurt us. It's what they were designed to do. But somehow we're willing to overlook these facts because this story is really compelling. Why is it so compelling? Because it speaks to our fears. 40% of American households with children have guns. I'm a parent. I want you to sit with that one for a minute. And if you don't think that someone that you know has a gun in their home, Try asking. It's not easy to do. It's a little embarrassing. I work in this field. I found it hard. You also may, as I did, assume that people in your circle don't have a gun. Try asking. I found out my 6-year-old's best friend lives in a home with a gun. To which I said, your friend is welcome to come over and play at our house anytime. Our house. But we're shy to ask because this story is really strong and we are afraid to engage. We're afraid to enter into some sort of confrontation. We don't want to get into an argument, and so we're willing to compromise our children's safety. We would never do that with a pool. There's a pool in your house? Do you have a guardrail across it? Is it covered? Is my kid going to fall into it when you're not looking? This needs to be part of our normal conversation. Because the idea that we need guns is frankly ridiculous. The gun homicide rate in the United States is 4 times that of Switzerland or Turkey. It's 30 times higher than the UK or France or Israel. Guns are not making us safer. These are not necessary tools to defend democracy. What they are doing is killing 30,000 Americans each year. And who's being hurt with these guns? This is the ugly part of the story. This is the part we don't like to talk about. African Americans aged 15 to 19 are 4 times more likely to be injured with a gun than white people. 2.5 times more likely than Hispanics. Because let's be honest about how this story we're being told really goes. White people are not being shot by black people who break into their homes. Black people are the ones who are dying from gun violence in huge numbers. But we tell ourselves these are all gang members. We're here in LA, we watch the news. We know those are violent young people. Buckle your seatbelts. There we go. It's hard to see that line. But if you look at that blue line up on top, what you're going to see is that at the height of the gang violence epidemic, less than half of the gun homicides were due to gang activity. That line up on top is the total number of gun deaths, and where we are now in 2007, the most recent year for which we have data, under 25% of the gun homicides are due to gangs. So when we look at the facts, we start to see a different story. But the story that we need guns to keep us safe, it continues. Because there are people very invested in selling us this story. So let's be really clear. The people who tell us that guns will make us safe are not in the business of selling safety. They are in the business of selling guns. And if you doubt that, think about this. There are technologies being developed that would create biometric safety locks. Only the registered owner with the blueprint or the fingerprint can pull the trigger. There are standards of practice for selling guns that would drastically reduce sales to illegal owners and to straw purchases. These are standards that have been advocated by Mayors Against Gun Violence. They've actually been put into place by Walmart, of all people. So these are measures that would improve safety without a single regulation or restriction. But the gun lobby opposes them. Why? It makes it harder and more expensive to sell guns. They're selling a product. We have to remember that when they start playing to our fears. It's a very effective marketing tool. These gunshot wounds are also incredibly expensive. The average cost for the hospitalization of a gunshot wound is $426,000. That's almost $500,000 every time someone goes to the hospital because they've been shot. Do you know what we're projected to spend in the coming year in the great state of California to educate our kids? I bring this up because any of you who know me, you know that I am always saying schools are the most effective violence prevention tool we have at our disposal. And if we're serious about investing in prevention, we need to invest in our schools. So here's the number that we spend on our students, less than $8,000. That's according to the California Budget Project. Yep. So what does that mean here? In Los Angeles in 2011, there were 1,124 hospitalizations for gunshot wounds. 139 were unintentional, 26 were self-inflicted, and 959 were assaults or homicides. So let's look at the unintentional number, because these are the ones of accidental shootings, the one you read about, people who had their guns in their homes because they thought they needed them to be safe, and then it got used accidentally. So 139 times 426,000, I'll spare you trying to do the math. It's 59,241,800. That's almost $60 million just in Los Angeles County in 1 year. You can play with some of the other numbers on your own, but if you want the grand total, 1,124 hospitalizations times 426,000, we get to almost $500 million per year in Los Angeles County. So now hopefully you're a little bit outraged, and you want to know, what can we do about it? Well, I know from the streets of Pasadena, when the open carry was being debated, and the All Saints community, and with the leadership and partnership of Assemblymember Portantino, this is a community that likes to engage and isn't afraid to roll up your hands. So there's two places that I think this community has a special and powerful role to play. The first is advocating for systems change. And this means policy. It's not sexy. It's writing letters, it's making phone calls. I know that's frustrating. It doesn't feel like you're doing a whole lot. It's not as satisfying as marching or being in a rally, but it really does make a difference. With our vote, we create a contract with our elected officials. This is really important to remember. Our end of the contract is to let them know what we want, so speak up. And when you are lucky enough to have someone like Assemblymember Portantino, and he is leading with this kind of legislation, call him and tell him we got your back. Thank you. They need to hear that too. Because your vote is what's going to counteract the well-funded opposition. Because that's what the money is there for. It's there to try to spend a lot of money on ads to try to convince people to vote a certain way. So if you can call your elected officials, write them a letter and say, you know what matters to me, what my vote hinges on, is that you take public safety seriously, and you put the interests of our children and the safety of our communities ahead of the special business interests of a single industry. The second thing that I think this community has a particular responsibility for is to help change the story that's being told. The faith community is a powerful voice, and you guys should own this. We have to reclaim public safety as a public responsibility. It's our responsibility. Gun violence isn't somebody else's issue. Domestic violence becomes lethal when you introduce a gun. Teen suicide, youth suicide, this is enabled by a gun in the home. Even the mass shootings that we hear about in schools, these often have their root in bullying. It's not someone else's issue, which means the solution is not up to somebody else. We have to take responsibility for our part in it. If we see public safety as a collective responsibility, we have to change our behavior, and we have to not be afraid to talk about guns and the gun issue. Now, again, Assemblymember Portantino testified that it's a hard topic to engage with. It takes a lot of courage. But I think you guys have a lot of a history of leadership on this, so I know I'm not talking to a bunch of cowards here. If we operate from a place of fear, if we say we do not trust our neighbors, if we don't accept our neighbors as our neighbors or as part of our community, then having a gun is a rational response. But if instead we say that we believe our fellow human beings are good people who want to live in safety, if we operate from a place of love instead of a place of fear, then we recognize that guns have no place in living in that kind of relationship to each other. It's our responsibility, and it's your particular responsibility as a faith community to tell the story that we are not afraid of each other. Change is possible. I hope you take this away. It seems like a big, daunting issue. It seems impossible. So is smoking. And we've come a huge way on that one. What we see as normal can change in our lifetime. And that's what it means to say gun violence is not a political issue. Don't engage in it on that front. It's an epidemic. This is an issue of public health. If we put safety first, then that debate goes away and we can focus on what really matters. We have to change the stories that we tell. We have to not accommodate and say it's okay to have a weapon that's designed to kill another human being in your home because we're afraid that might make you feel bad. We weren't afraid to make people who smoke feel bad. And we still created a space for them to make that choice if they wanted to. We have to not be afraid to do that. This is a country whose collective identity cannot be based on being afraid of others. So we cannot accept the story that's being sold to us. We have to take it upon ourselves to proclaim we believe in welcoming the outsider, making guns uncool and unacceptable. And we have to invest in our young people instead of being afraid of them. Because when we believe that, then we can make change. And we can make it in one generation. So I hope as we go into the breakout groups, that we'll really wrestle with some ways that you guys can all engage and become ambassadors on this issue. And that you have tools to do it, and you have some places to tap in. So thank you all for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
That was powerful, and we really appreciate it. Were we going to do Q&A? Okay, that's great. Let's do that.
Any questions?
Could you give that statistic again on how many hospital visits in California per year? Or did you just have LA County?
I just had LA County. It was 1,124 in 2011. In Los Angeles County in 1 year.
You said something interesting to me. You said many interesting things, but the thing that caught my attention was when you made the analogy to smokers, and you said we didn't feel bad about making them feel bad, and we made space for them. How would you make space? What's the analogy here?
I think that's where you see a lot of the legislation that isn't looking to register guns or take everybody's guns away. What we're saying is if we're going to prioritize public safety, the background checks is a great example. We have agreed collectively as a country that we believe that there are some people who shouldn't have guns. And so we do background checks. So then to say, okay, we're only going to background check some people in some circumstances, that's not consistent. We're not saying we're going to take guns away. You still have a space to have your gun. We're just going to say we're also going to make public safety a priority. So we're going to change how we talk about guns a little bit too. And we have to not be afraid to say guns aren't always cool.
I think the statistic about hospital costs is so shockingly enormous that I think that in America and in our city where overspending of budgets is so prevalent, this should be your main propaganda, or if you call it that, to fight that, because people would say, oh, my purse hurts, I don't want to give up that money. Whereas if it's stating that another person or another kid is being shot, they say, oh, how sad. That's it. But when it hits your purse, there will be action.
It's really true. And of course, what we know is also many of these are costs that are borne by the taxpayers, because these are not often folks who have the really high-end insurance. So it definitely is a public cost, and it's a very old saying, but a very true one, the ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure. That's why I put those two numbers up next to each other, because I really, really believe that.
I wanted to ask the question, in your experience in talking about this subject, have there been some communities where You've seen some success in the way the community responded, and if so, could you give a couple of examples so we can model after that, maybe?
Sure. That's an interesting question. I think often you have people who are willing to engage in the debate. What I found really helpful is moving away from the politics and moving away from a Second Amendment discussion and saying if we really talk about this as a public health issue, then we can actually engage with what it's about. Instead of engaging in a little red and blue left and right sort of back and forth. Where have we seen it be very successful? I think across the board. As I said, I was speaking at the Empowerment Congress, which is South Los Angeles, and it really that folks from other issue areas, folks who didn't see gun violence as their issue, are starting to come in on this, and I think that's part of where we're going to see some of the change happen. I was actually listening to the radio on the way over here, and I heard your own Pasadena Arts Center just did a project doing a children's book trying to reframe guns as not cool, and they were talking about that, and I thought what a tremendous thing to do. So you guys are such a great community out here. You're really showing a lot of leadership.
Excuse me, I have a comment and question related to the role that the film, media, entertainment industry plays in this. What is your perspective on their role in this? I keep seeing billboards where guns and violence is glamorized, and it's just like chewing gum. And I don't hear too much about the film, the media, the entertainment industry at all in this debate.
I think that's a really good question. And I haven't seen it, so I don't want to disparage the film, but I know that, I think it was right after Newtown, there was that Tom Cruise film, that all the billboards like this and the justified billboards like this. It was a little hard to stomach right at that particular moment in time. I do think it has an impact on our collective psyche. And that's part of what we're talking about when we're saying we need to change some of the norms around this, and we need to enlist the media to help us do that. With smoking, there was a very active group that took it upon themselves to lobby the entertainment industry all the time. And they were just like a mosquito that said, you gotta stop having your cool rebel characters smoking all the time. You know, actors are not lazy. They don't need just one prop. They can demonstrate that characteristic in other ways. You don't need to have them smoking all the time. So I think that would be a very interesting way to engage, to say, how do you just commit to, a real hard battle, but continue to say, what are some other ways that we can frame this? How do we start talking about, I was talking with a bunch of young people, and they started coming up with, we need to say that guns are like the response of somebody weak. If it was hand-to-hand combat, that's what's, masculine. I thought, okay, well, that's better, I guess. But that there was, how do you work around some of that messaging? And the young people they came up with it right away. They said, a gun is for people who can't come up with another way out of it. They can't use their wits. They can't talk their way down. And so I think there is a role to play. I think it's a challenging one. But I also know that was part of the strategy with the smoking campaign.
Well, that's a good segue to my question. I think in the 1950s until the early 60s, the tobacco industry launched a very successful campaign to obscure scientific research and to make it seem as if smoking wasn't really dangerous. I've discovered to my chagrin that the United States government has stifled research on the effects of guns, that the Center for Disease Control can't do that kind of research because of a law passed by Congress in '96. And I'm wondering, what can we do to reverse those laws and give science the opportunity to present valid data that could have the same kind of impact that the Attorney General's report had on smoking in the early 60s? What is your thinking on that?
That's an excellent question, and that's a huge area of advocacy. And it's true, and I will say that the NRA had a significant impact on passing that ban. The Centers for Disease Control was not allowed to do research on gun violence because it became a Second Amendment issue as opposed to, again, a public health issue. That was one of the things that President Obama did in the wake of Newtown. It was an executive order, was that he lifted the ban on the CDC, and I know that I've seen several requests for research proposals have gone out already. There are a handful of researchers who stuck through it through those years when there was no funding, and so they're starting to push their material out. But I think that is one of the places where we're going to have some success, is to say, you know, you hear a lot of these gun laws, they won't make a difference, it doesn't matter, it wouldn't have an impact. But again, when you look at what research we do have, it does. And that's why they don't want the research. So I think the more we can support it, the more we can turn to hard numbers. That's part of this changing of the story. And is to say that exactly, when we know some of the facts, and the more we can say those facts in the face of the fear-mongering, that's what's going to change the story. So that's an excellent question. That's absolutely what we should be doing, is pushing for that research.
Last question.
Two things. It seems to me cigarette smoking, they mobilized children. There was a lot done on children's television and so on, and my father was a heavy smoker, and I know my children were young at the time, and they had a lot to do with my father stopping smoking. So I think that because this has been an issue recently of so many children dying, to mobilize children against guns would have a great impact. The other thing, you showed a slide up there that I think was either a photograph or drawing of a gun, and then all those facts about, you know, how many people die and so on. Yeah, that one. Is it possible to get that and distribute it? Because I'm thinking of sending a letter to my Christmas list.
Wonderful.
A personal letter and something like that to go on record about how dangerous this is.
Wonderful.
And then certainly that economic number was just fabulous.
I'm happy to make any of this available.
Great, thank you.
I'll send that to Virginia, whoever the right person is, and they can get out. And that's an excellent point also about using young people. I think that is part of why the smoking campaign worked, was the idea of the secondhand smoke, that it wasn't just your own personal choice, that it had an impact on other people that had no choice about it. So I think, again, when thinking about strategies to say, how do we change this story, again, that's part of the public health approach. We say this isn't about the Second Amendment. This is about our collective health, and it impacts children, and it impacts people who are bearing the repercussions of your choice to have this weapon in the home. That's absolutely a great idea. You're welcome. There was one more. I don't know. Okay. All right.
Thank you. All right, let's move our agenda here. We're going to next move to our breakout sessions, and we have 3 sessions tonight. The first one is going to be in this hall. It's going to be about advocacy and direct action, and I think it's going to be an excellent opportunity to engage, talk about how we can take this and use through our own efforts and the efforts of as a collective community to take direct action on the issue of gun violence prevention. And there's going to be another session in the second floor at the Regas House on public health and gun violence. And then third, there's going to be one up in the Sweetland Hall, which is the first floor. And that's going to be a presentation about Second Amendment issues, a little bit about the law, federal, state, and local. So I invite you all to please stay. We're going to come back after those sessions and report back to what we've learned. Okay. I can do that. Okay, I'm happy to do that. For the advocacy section, we have Angelica Salazar. Nice to see you. And thank you. She's of the Children's Defense Fund. The Children's Defense Fund has been a national leader on this issue of gun violence and how it affects our community and our children. And along with Angelica are Maddie Gavel-Briggs and Patrick Briggs, who are Occupy Democracy Pasadena community activists. And they're also going to be talking about what we can do as a Pasadena community. In the public health session, we have Patty Colross, who is a doctor, an MD and PH, and Daniel Healy, and both of them are from the Violence Prevention Coalition of Los Angeles. Thank you. And they're going to be talking about community-based strategies to prevent gun violence. And on the guns and the law, it'll be Charles Sorosi, the gentleman there in the blue blazer, and myself, who we're going to talk about the Second Amendment and some of the other issues surrounding that. So please stay. Please stay after, and we'll reconvene after the breakout sessions. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Angelica. I'm with the Children's Defense Fund. I'm a policy advocate. And the Children's Defense Fund is a national children's policy advocacy, research, and programmatic organization. And I want to say that I think we've been publishing a gun report, I think maybe it's been 20 years. We take data from the CDC on the number of children that are killed by guns every year and publish that out. And so this is an area that we have been monitoring for a long time. And, you know, it wasn't until after Sandy Hook that really it became more, let's say, politically palatable to a lot of people in Congress and at a state level, like Kaile said and Dennis said, and the assembly member said, California has some of the better pieces of legislation, but on a national level, it's a patchwork. And so we're hopefully going to take advantage of this opportunity, even though we know that in a lot of communities, gun violence has been a reality for a long time. The goal, in the next hopefully 10 minutes, I hope to be brief, so we have lots of time for questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about some stats that we put out and kind of a how-to on federal advocacy or just advocacy in general on this issue. So again, thank you for being here. And I'm going to channel Mrs. Marian Wright Edelman a little bit and say that the best Mother's Day gift that could have been given over the weekend was the gun buyback. And I was so happy to see on the news at home coverage of what took place over the weekend in Pasadena. And I'm not from Pasadena, I'm from Duarte, which is not too far, but I claim Pasadena because no one ever knows where Duarte is. So anyway, I was proud. I was proud of the city of Pasadena. Okay, so and just also as background, what I do, so I'll give a tiny disclaimer, that my expertise is not in gun control. What I work on is education at the Children's Defense Fund. We have 2 offices in California, one in Oakland, one in Los Angeles, and our national office is in DC. They've really been taking the lead in putting out a lot of the data that you see, and if you're on our listserv, for instance, those emails come from our national office. But we do have 2 offices here in California, and what I work on now is the school discipline piece. So when we see schools that have a very high number of suspensions, expulsions, we call that a push out. So a lot of students who don't finish high school often say that they drop out of school. But if they have been disengaged from school for a period of years, partly because of the quality of the instruction and partly because of the effort to keep them engaged, we say that they're pushed out of school. And so I've been working on statewide legislation reform on that topic, as well as some reform in the District of Long Beach for the last year. And we're trying to see how we can broaden from there onto violence prevention more generally at a local level. And so, because we know those things are related, what happens to kids when they're not in school and they're not supervised and they're out in the community, and if the community, there's a lot of guns in those communities, that's a big risk. And so, very excited to learn more with you here tonight. So one statistic, and I know that we talked a little bit about children in the plenary, but based on data from 2010, one child dies or is injured from guns every 30 minutes, based on the rates that we've seen recently. More than 1 out of every 5 teens have witnessed a shooting. So when we talk about, secondhand smoke, there's those that experience very directly the impact of guns, either by being injured or being killed. Then there's all the exposure to violence, and that toxic stress that's part of our communities because of gun violence is another very negative impact. We talked a bit about the racial disparities, so I'll just say it in different terms. 45% of gun deaths among children are among black children, while they only make up 15% of the child population. And so huge disproportionality, mainly among black children. So as you know, in mid-April, about a month ago, the gun control package did not pass the Senate. 45 senators voted against it. And despite the fact that, as we heard, 90% of Americans support background checks. That gun bill package had been watered down quite a bit. It didn't have the assault weapons ban that we wanted, that a lot of people are advocating for. But background checks, very common sense, gun safety law, a lot of reasonable people, even if they own guns, were in favor of that legislation. Unfortunately, it failed. However, it was recently introduced in the House by a Republican from New York, Pete King, and a Democrat. Exactly, yes, Mike Thompson from I think Sonoma, up in the Northern California. And so, we'll see what happens in the House. We know the politics are different there, but they have already gotten, I think someone mentioned 160 co-sponsors in a day or two. I think it was introduced recently. So that's encouraging, and we have to keep fighting. I think that if we keep hearing it in the news and in the media, we know that we haven't forgotten. A lot of folks on that side, the NRA, are kind of banking on the possibility that we'll just forget, and the tragedy will kind of pass, and we'll move on to something else. So we have to keep it alive for as long, until we get something passed. So the Children's Defense Fund advocates for background checks, closing the gun show loophole. Is everyone familiar with that term? Similar to the loophole that the assembly member was describing, I think about, I don't know if these are all gun show loophole gun purchases, but about 40% of gun sales are done without a background check. One of those ways is when they buy them at gun sales, where it's a private seller who is not licensed, but because in the law it says they are allowed to sell guns without background checks. So that's one way of obtaining a gun without a background check, but there are many. And also assault bans weapon, and also simple, again, common sense, when you have medicine and you have it in your home, it's childproof, right? There's safety measures on that, bottle of aspirin or whatever it is. We need to have those kinds of devices on guns, and as Kaile pointed out, why don't we have them? One of the reasons is because it costs more to put those safety devices on guns, and so we have to push back. We have to push back because we need that for our children. With so many guns in so many homes, we especially need safety standards. So as far as how-to, I think the first thing that kind of comes to mind is exactly what you're doing this evening, is convening community members, talking about how it affects your community, what are the resources in the community as far as information and knowledge to learn more about the issue, and then building capacity around actions. Who are our elected officials? What are the moving vehicles for changing gun laws? Those are things that you're already doing, and so you're ahead of the curve. Media. Use it effectively, use it often. Again, as long as we keep seeing, stories of young people, of Americans being affected by gun violence and the efforts to curb that violence, then we know that it hasn't been forgotten. We know that we're still making efforts to change the laws to prevent gun violence. So we need to use media effectively, and we need to use it often. And so op-eds, letters to the editor, and we need to be, Kaile says change the story. It's also about telling the story. So we have to keep circulating that. A few coalitions have been mentioned this evening, like the Brady Campaign, Mayors Against Legal Guns, the Coalition Against Gun Violence. There are a number of groups across the country that I'm familiar with that, have resources already. They have petitions that you can sign. They have letters. They have talking points. They have data. So use that information. We don't have to recreate the wheel. It's been mentioned already, but engaging with elected officials. So yeah, writing letters, calling in. That makes a big difference, especially if you have like a call-in day where all of your constituents call in on a particular day, and then you're doing it maybe in coalition with other churches. The faith community has a very, very powerful and effective voice, in talking about this as a moral issue, bringing dignity back to our communities that are currently plagued by all this criminalization and all sorts of things. So there's that. And then also, public hearings. It's great to have Assemblymember Portent, here he's an ally, but holding other elected officials accountable too. We have our senators, our federal senators, and other congresspeople or our representatives in D.C. that we also need to make sure, especially now that this is in the House, although again, California, we don't have quite as an uphill battle as other places, but certainly there are places in California where, more rural areas where these pieces of legislation are not supported. And kind of the last thing is, if you work with youth in any capacity, even if your neighbors, or if you're in a program, or you volunteer, or in your job, wherever it may be, your family, your children, make sure to provide as much mentoring as you can. We don't always know what kind of exposure to violence those kids have had. So it's important to come from a place of caring. It's important to think about youth development in a positive light. Provide those opportunities where they grow and develop and learn in a positive way. And if they have had experience in this, in the area of gun violence, encourage them to tell their story. It's very healing to tell the story. In a way that you feel that you're going to educate folks and you're going to possibly push a change. That's part of the healing process too. And so if you work with youth, always have that lens in mind where you're coming from a healing place, a place of positive youth development, and you encourage them to tell their stories because it's not obviously it's healing for them, but it also helps the cause, having youth, someone mentioned at the very end, bringing children back into the equation. And some of the best reforms I've seen, just from my perspective on school discipline, is actually bringing students up to Sacramento and having a whole line of, 30 students that say, I support A, B, whatever. That makes a huge difference in the eyes of legislators. And just, when you have youth and children empowered to tell their own story, it's very powerful. So finally, I'll just say we have resources on our website, www.childrensdefense.org. There's an online petition. The fact sheets that I passed out and are on the table, there are lots more on our website. Our gun report is on there. And so to the extent that that's helpful, and of course, if you have any questions moving forward, like I said, I'm not the expert, but I could just call or email the folks in D.C. if you have questions, need a citation or what have you. So thank you for having me here. Happy to answer more questions. I'll pass it on now to Patrick or Maddie.
Before we start, I'm just a quick question about the Advocacy Institute.
Oh, yes.
I'm very curious about that.
Kaile was just telling me about that as I was walking in, and she asked me to make a plug. So I'm so happy you mentioned it, because I didn't make a plug. I'm going to pull the sheet out. So this is something that is Kaile here? Yeah. Oh, better yet.
Sure. Thank you.
It's a very simple, very basic. It's 3 2-hour sessions over the summer when the legislation is usually sort of on hiatus, and this came out of several conversations with folks at Children's Defense Fund and the Drug Policy Alliance, and people who say, all of the advocates and lobbyists are up in Northern California, and all of the community organizers and the people who are really leading the way on this issue are in Southern California, and so we really need to empower some of our real Southern California community leaders to be advocates, old-fashioned advocates. So this is a very down and dirty, very basic overview of policy advocacy, what the legislative calendar looks like, when you need to write letters and why, and what testimony means, what it means when bills are moving through committee. It's basically Schoolhouse Rock for grown-ups. So.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions for Angelica, I'll just introduce Maddie and myself. I'm Patrick, and my wife Maddie. We are co-leaders in a group called Occupy Democracy Pasadena. It's a group among many activist groups, I think, in our community. And I think what we might bring to this discussion is maybe a little bit about how easy it actually is to become involved in the street with your legislature and doing actually even policy advocacy. With that said, I mean, our group was started 2 years ago just because we were concerned. We cared about an issue that was really bothering us, and that was just the unfairness of our economic system that we have. And I don't want to go off topic here, but we were upset enough about it that we went out and we had people come join us at these rallies that we did at Colorado and Lake. And enough people kept coming back, the same people who were concerned, and we decided that, why don't we make ourselves into some kind of a group that the media can actually identify, because the media was asking questions. You talk about using media as a tool for advocacy, and that we realized that we could do that. And our group morphed into having kind of a strategic focus. Rather than just reacting all the time, we decided that we wanted to actually try to change something. And I'll use case in point, and do you want to talk about that, or? Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll let Maddie talk about this because this is equal sharing here.
Okay. Yeah, I think what was happening with the Occupy movement, where we got our name, was so dramatic to us. We were just delighted to see people actually taking action in the streets, all these young people putting life and limb on the line for things that they believed in, to actually shine a light on the inequities that were going on. Our group is a little bit older. We tell people that we're occupying the concept of democracy. We're a little too old to camp out. We're not about to take the sleeping bag in the park and stuff, but we really admired what that movement was about. So that's where we got our name. We think that democracy only works when you participate. So we want to create an open invitation for people to do that in any capacity that they think they can. Sometimes people think they can't really take that first step out on the sidewalk. It's a very vulnerable place to be, but when you're with others that share those values, you feel you have community and you have that protection. One of our primary focuses is the community, is building community. And what I loved especially about Kaile's talk was this thing about talking about this for once, not being kind of cowed into the corner because our culture has said that guns are cool and that people that oppose that are wimpy or in some way. I think those kids really have the answer right there, that we have to create that new framework that having guns is really a sign of weakness and a sign of fear and a sign that we're lost. We've lost our way in community when we can't go next door and talk to someone and say, I'm feeling this way or I'm feeling vulnerable. We have to keep a gun under our pillow to make our fears, hold our fears at bay. Getting back to what you were talking to, we really identified a lot of what was happening, the inequity, the 99%, the 1%, was with what happened with the Supreme Court decision of a couple years ago that ruling that basically gave corporations personhood and said as such they can give undisclosed amounts of money to any political campaign, unleashed the floodgates of money in the political process, just kind of killing democracy. So one of our big principles is overturning Citizens United. We know that it takes a constitutional amendment. That's a huge thing. 20 or 2/3 of the states have to ratify. We then had our representative Schiff here in Pasadena, and any of you who are from Pasadena know he's a little bit of a blue dog. He kind of tests the wind to see which way it's going. He's very cautious, very bright man, very good man, but a constitutional law attorney. We met with him, and he was firmly planted in this idea that he couldn't support a constitutional amendment. He couldn't co-author a resolution. He couldn't even sign on to an existing one. So we met with him, and at the time that we had been getting petitions already.
One of the reasons we got to meet. I'll just pick up. One of the reasons that we got to meet with him was simply because we were out in the street. We were out multiple times in the street, and the newspapers picked that up. And when that happened, we got a call from his office asking if we'd like to meet with him. We got called. I mean, it was really an amazing thing to have a group, ours, a relatively new group, be called in to a congressman's office. And instead of only getting 15 minutes, we ended up, I think we were there for 30 or 40. Yeah, we were there for a little while. And in the end, at that meeting, we weren't able to persuade him that a constitutional amendment was a valid way to deal with the issue. We kept going, though. We didn't stop after that. And we realized he was moving into a new district, so we changed our strategy. We got more petitions at our local farmers markets, but we went to local farmers markets in Hollywood, which is where he was going to be a lot of his constituency. And we kept going and handing out flyers, call his office, let him know that you want this to happen. We even dressed up in goofy costumes for the Doodah Parade to try to street theater, to try to get people. I pretended I was Congressman Schiff, and I handed out information saying, help me decide. I was a great undecider. So this kind of creativity and fun and putting it out in the street ultimately led to June, I think it was like June 15th or 18th, we got a call from the Pasadena Weekly asking for comment because he had authored his own House Joint Resolution with the assistance of Lawrence Tribe, a constitutional scholar, for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. So I say this only, and Maddie says this only as an example that small group of people can make a difference, and it applies to gun control. It applies to so many other issues. And so I think that's what we're trying to say is you can be effective as a small group. It can be fun. You can create a safe space for people who normally would never do these kind of things. I mean, we had people in our leadership team who been to many rallies, and they were scared to go see their congressman. I mean, I don't want to do that. That's just too much for me. But a couple people who'd never done it sat in there, and they came out of it, and they were even more impassioned about this kind of thing. So I think that's our main purpose, I think, in being here is to tell people you can do this, and it can be effective. Now, I caution you, don't be attached to the results. I think this is a process thing. Whether it's gun control as a public health issue, or whether it's Citizens United or anything else you advocate for, the beautiful thing about it is that you get to be in contact with your neighbors and people in your community, and you come out feeling even more alive. I mean, I've gone to things where at the end of the day, I just want to go home and rest, and I go to these things I'm supposed to go to, and I feel more alive and more energetic than when I went into it. And I think that's true for you too. So.
Let's speak specifically.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Give me that mic. This is what it's like at home. Okay. No, I just dovetailing on that to actually bring it around to gun control. So then we can start talking about ideas here. Our group hadn't really had that on its radar. We co-lead civic engagement ministry here at All Saints, in addition to our Occupy group. We wear a couple different hats, and we love to cross-pollinate and do that sort of thing. When the Sandy Hook tragedy happened in December, I think everyone just collectively was shock, numb, awe, and then the anger, because already the NRA had its talking points, and they were giving that nice little interim period where they just respect the tragedy and all of that BS that they do. We wanted to get out there right away. We chose to do a vigil at City Hall, and it was a joint effort of our Occupy group and the Civic Engagement here, members from Sustainable World and the church. Mayor Bill Bogart attended. We wanted to have some really. Well, we invited him, and he came because he's a member of Mayors Against Gun Violence. Anyhow, we wanted to take a more forceful approach to that one because I just give me your damn gun right now. That's what I wanted. But we wanted to do something that was inviting people into the dialogue, wherever they were on that spectrum of shock or hurt. We even had some people there that we know for a fact own guns. So this was the starting point where we realized that we could start talking to people, and out of all of that tragedy, the common sense could start floating to the top. Things like background checks. And I think framing it as the public health issue is something that is going to turn this around. I see that when I saw the context given for the smoking and the seat belts. We followed that action in March at the Glendale Gun Show. I don't know if anyone's aware, but there was a lot of flack about whether Glendale was going to allow this gun show. And to us, it seemed nonsensical that they were having. I had read an article in the paper that Glendale was having some issues with school security, so they were going to be implementing security cameras because they were worried about people bringing guns in. So what were they doing? Glendale was sponsoring on city property a gun show right next to a school on the opening day of Little League, right near a skate park. Talk about your public health hazard. So it didn't make sense. So we decided to go out and be a presence at that gun show. And, it was a little intimidating. We had throngs of people coming across the street, pulling their little, those little carts and things so that they could take their ammo out with them, and bringing their children in. And, it was really a sight. But we were a presence. There was a lot of media. I wish I had heard your talk before I did my little sound bites, because I did get in it about the Second Amendment with this young man. I told him he could have a musket. I was okay with him having a musket. But it was really good because we got the press, and then the city council did come to vote in the next week or two, and we think ours was another drop in the bucket of that community vigilance about that issue, and Glendale is not having any more gun shows.
Yes.
So, it just, for me, I think you bring your passion. Everybody here has passion. Everybody here has an issue. And then the only thing you got to start honing is your vigilance and your sense that you will keep coming back to it. Because if we collectively as a nation keep coming back to this issue, and I read an article this morning that said, this is not going away because of the people that have committed to it. So if we can make a small commitment, I think we can do something.
And I think with that, we could open up to questions or comments about either what Angelica had to say or what we had to say.
Well, I'm delighted to hear of these success stories. I've been involved with the Pasadena area gun buyback, and my passion is engaging the religious community, because I think that almost all the great social change movements in America, going back to the abolition of slavery, women's rights, civil rights, and many of the anti-war movements, have had that strong religious energy that's helped to keep people going for the long haul. So I got involved because I was on the planning committee for the Palm Sunday Peace Parade, and we thought that this year's theme should be beating swords into plowshares. And my wife Jill said, well, why don't we have a gun buyback? And a couple of women got together and talked it over, and the next thing we knew, we had Jaylene Mosley involved with the Flint Ridge Center and the city and the police and churches. We raised over $20 $100,000 from the churches. And what was particularly interesting and exciting for me is it was the whole theological spectrum, from little conservative, almost fundamentalist Baptist churches to the Unitarians and the more liberal churches, all united around this idea that we must do something to end gun violence, and we have to put our money where our mouth is. And we had not only a successful gun buyback, where the 135 weapons were turned in, but we also had a Peace Source fair, where pastors and civic leaders and executive directors of nonprofits shared their stories, their experiences with gun violence, and what they were doing to make a difference. And I think that's an important element in the healing process. I think that one of the things that I've been aware of is the kind of idolatry of guns in America. And just as we were organizing this gun buyback, I learned that the governor of Arizona has passed a bill that would make it illegal to destroy any guns that are surrendered to the police department in Arizona. They must be resold. And this is now part of the, I believe, the national strategy of NRA to make gun buybacks impossible. That's the bad news. I think the good news is that the gun buybacks obviously are seen by the NRA as having symbolic value, like the sit-ins at the diners, you got lunch counters in the South. These symbolic gun buybacks and things of this sort are uniting communities around this issue. And I would love to see more involvement in the churches, by the churches, because I think there's both the public health issue and the spiritual healing that needs to happen in our country. So that's, I guess, where I'm at is what's the next step for the churches? You know, All Saints was just a powerful force in this gun buyback. What do we do next? How do we mobilize the moral power of the churches in the same way that they engaged in the civil rights movement to end gun violence in America? How do we do that? And I think churches have a real stake in it. I mean, pastors are the ones who have to preside at funerals. We had a priest talking about the funerals he had, as a priest, had to go to, where he would, have to console parents who lost their children to this. So I think the churches have a deep moral and emotional stake in healing this national disease, this epidemic.
Can I make a comment just to that, add on to it, and just say that maybe another question to ask is, without losing our focus on what this issue is at hand, what is it that the church can do to promote public life in our community so that more people get involved? I mean, around this circle, there are at least half of us I know of for sure, are activists, and it would be nice to find a way, fundamentally, with this issue and with any issue, is to get people to feel an obligation and a responsibility and the great joy of being in community with others for issues of justice and peace. So I think that would be a good thing for the churches in this area to consider too, at a very basic level. And I know Marna Cornell here, she's with the League of Women Voters, and she is very much an active person in promoting community.
I don't really have anything in particular to add to this. The League, of course, is for gun safety, and we want to do everything we can. And we did have a letter writing day. We have an advocacy director, and we want to do more of that. And so we would just like to know what's going on in the community and how can we get this out to our members, because that's, we have, and we're growing. We're 10% more than we were before. And I think part of it is people are realizing when they vote, that's not the end. that's just one step. And if you just say, well, I voted, and now I can go back to my own little life, and I don't have to do anything else, it's not going to make the change. You have to keep at it and keep at your representatives and your elected officials or people of authority. We had a forum on air quality, and it's just the point of talking about a lot, like the Department of Water and Power and Air Resources Board, and they were saying, if you want things to change, we're in favor, we're doing everything, but keep up the pressure, keep calling us, keep doing things, keep phoning us. We have to be there. We have to keep doing these things. So we would like to work, I'm president of the Pasadena area, which includes 9 other cities besides Pasadena of the league. South Pass, Monterey Park, Monrovia, Sierra Madre, Alhambra. And so we would like to work with other and coalitions. I mean, we're really into that as much as we can. We cannot participate if it has anything to do with supporting a candidate as such or opposing a candidate as such. But we do have an advocacy arm, and we do talk to, on an issue, we very definitely talk to legislators or other public officials. So we want to be part of whatever comes out of this.
As I listen to all of this, I see the whole issue is twofold. I think the legislative, the activism is critical. But I also think there's a root to it. And the root has to do with when children are very young. It starts preschool, it goes into elementary, it goes into high school. The intermediate level is really critical, because that's when they become very desensitized to the violence around them. And I don't know what Pasadena Unified is doing. I know they have some policies, I've heard that, but my experience is school districts have policies and it just stops there. It doesn't always continue. I know that teachers are extremely overworked and may not really have the time with all the curriculum pressures they have to do very much. So I guess my question is, is there a way that All Saints, the church communities, is there a way they can work with the schools? Because the schools don't really have the money, and they don't have very many people that can be involved. I mean, that's the reality. And so I guess I'm wondering, how does that work where we get to the children? Because they are the future voters. They're the ones that are going to vote. And they're living in a society with tremendous violence around them, and it's attractive. And I look at it, I mean, just look at the movies that are out there and the news and what's really going on. So that's my question is, how is this going to work with the schools?
Perfect segue.
I just had a commentary just on how I experienced. Okay, so what you're saying I think is all correct. With that, it really there needs to be a more prevalent role of teaching the youth about this, and I feel like it needs to be not targeted even at one age, but just a very for all ages, because I feel when I was just growing up in school, they teach you, if you see a gun, don't touch it, all these things, and if you see someone with a gun, do not go near them unless it's a police officer, those kind of basic rules. But as you grow older, as you said, people do become desensitized, and then they do touch on it a few times in middle school. I was at a private school, but my friends at public schools, they had Pasadena Police Department come in and talk about it. But then I feel it kind of fades out, actually, when I went into high school, and I didn't really think about it that much, that often. My friends didn't, either public or private school. And then out of the blue, 2 weeks ago, my friend was at a party and someone pulled out a gun. And it's just, it's not always something that you think about. And I don't know who the person was who had the gun, but it shocked me when my friend later told me about this, that she was in a situation like that where there could have been harm caused to her or anyone else there. So it's just alarming how deeply, not deeply, but how much it's infiltrated every aspect of our community.
And just to add, I'm Francisco, everybody, and I work here. I'm on staff and direct our Peace and Justice Ministries, and I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. And I think that the reason why I think we intentionally paired, Angelica talking about issue advocacy, in particular about youth and children, and related to action, the work that Maddie and Patrick have done, both through the church and outside. I just think that we're looking at how do we look at the whole spectrum of engagement around this issue. It's not neither letter writing or holding signs and being in people's faces about an issue on their own will solve the problem, but collectively these are all sort of tactics and strategies that I think will lead to a bigger goal, right? And we're talking on Sunday we had a forum speaker. It was Adam Winkler about the constitutional law. But one thing that I took from his presentation was we don't really have a movement around this yet. Even though there's passion, there's anger, but there isn't a movement to make this happen. To take that 90% of people that want this to see background checks in legislation and to have people on the ground, troops on the ground, whether they're door knocking, writing letters, or holding signs, or making appointments with legislators. And I think that's what our role is, to add that moral voice through the church and to be engaged in civic life in all aspects, and to not let go of this, that sustained action that we really need. So I want to hear more. Every idea that people have, we will take seriously and figure out how does that fit into our sort of plan for making this into a movement. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to our facilitators.
I just wanted to give something concrete, and this is through my experience with a community group here in Pasadena called Leadership Pasadena, and it's a group that tries to build new community leaders every year, and it gets them exposure to the way the city government works and the way that all the different nonprofits that exist in Pasadena. And one of our particular client when I did the class was this gal named Diana Fisher with a group called Collaborate Now, or her foundation was called Collective Voices, and she's incredibly dynamic, and it makes me think that the church can offer, at the very least, its facilities for the kind of creative nonprofit that prophets like hers and others to come together to find some kind of creative way to reach to at the middle school level in particular, get them early before they are desensitized, and other ideas, whatever they might be. So I mean, I can easily reach out to some of my contacts there and ask them about this. They're getting ready. They're getting geared up to recruit for Leadership Pasadena for 2014, and that'll start in the fall once they've gotten everybody. So I think as a class project, I mean, they could end up doing something on gun control or guns as a public health issue. And if we had the right people advocating for that, they could present to the class in the fall and make that an option for them to do. So just throwing that out there.
I just had a question for you, Kaile. Sure. When you talked about systems and how it breaks down, I'm a former educator, so I come out of that, and I worked in the inner city. Where I worked in the Pico Union area, kids would find spent bullets on the playground. And I just wonder if here's an advocacy institute for adult, and there are many programs out for conflict resolution, because I think helping kids, there are going to be conflicts. You just can't get away from that. And it's like the drug thing, in my opinion. I'm not speaking for the Lee, I'm just speaking for me. Just saying no doesn't solve the hurt or what's going on that kids go to drugs. they need better coping, they need psychological help for their problems. So I think if we're going to have gun and people understand about gun safety, also we need to give youth alternatives.
I keep thinking I'm going to take off and go home, but this is so interesting. You're spot on. And I want to toss it back to some of the work that I know Angie's been doing with a bunch of partners. This school discipline issue, one of the things that's connected to that is using restorative principles as exactly a different mean to say, rather than disciplining kids and kicking them out of school, or then they're going to start, engaging with street violence. That again, we look at what is the root cause? Why is this child misbehaving? There's probably something at the root of that, and if we can start to talk about that, then we can start to again address the cause as opposed to responding to the behavior, and that it's all part of the same piece. And I think if we look at LA Unified, is it tomorrow afternoon? Is about to ban this category of willful defiance as a reason why you can suspend or expel young people, and instead promote the use of these restorative principles for exactly that reason, to say if we can empower our young people to resolve conflict, it's going to have a huge ripple effect down the line. And all of this comes out of the same framing. If we say stop responding to behavior with punishment, I have two little kids. And I know I can't say, stop hitting your sister. She doesn't really that much. But instead say, hit the pillow instead. You can't just say stop. It works with addicts. It works with children. It works with anything. You have to replace the behavior. So again, if our frame is to say what's causing this, as opposed to how do we respond to this behavior, how do we punish this behavior, and think that punishment is going to stop it. I don't know how many parenting books anybody else here has read. I think I've read all of them. Positive reinforcement. This works with our children. It works in our schools, and I think that's how we can really start to change the conversation around gun violence.
Just to add to that, because I'm so glad you asked the question, and I think when we think about gun violence, that's down the line. How do we model positive interactions for students at school? How do we model conflict resolution that's nonviolent, that's productive, that's healing, as adults? And then how do we encourage students to do that on an ongoing basis when things erupt in the classroom or out in the yard? I was a teacher for 3 years in El Sereno, and my first year was very difficult. Like you said, we put a lot of pressure on our teachers to, teach the standards and, get the test scores that we're supposed to get. And it does create this environment where, if so-and-so comes to school and there was something happening at home, and they're upset about it, or they haven't eaten that day, or, someone just passed away, they're not going to be in the mood to comply and say yes and, fill out the worksheet. And so I think we really need to meet students where they are, and we need to model that behavior of, going back to, guns being for wimps. Let's talk about our problems. Let's talk about, what happened with that fight. Why did you push so-and-so? And, getting to the root cause, as Kaile is saying. And so, we're seeing all of this momentum with reforming some of our school discipline policies to get to the root cause of these issues, because we know that we criminalize behavior a lot more at certain schools with certain students. We see black students really overrepresented in the same way that they're overrepresented in gun deaths also, and suspensions and incarceration rates. These things are all connected. And so there's a lot of, there are restorative justice is one of the programs. It's like a peace circle where students dialogue and you bring together the students that were involved in the altercation, and then teachers and peers, also like a peer jury, so that we all kind of learn, what was the harm that was done, what would be an appropriate but productive consequence, not just being kicked out, but you're going to do some community service, or you're going to, work with so-and-so on X. And so there's we have partners, and we can get them in touch with you who do trainings on restorative justice or transformative justice. So yeah, I went to a school growing up. I went to private school, and there was a security officer, and he was there to prevent outsiders from coming in, from hurting us. And now in so many schools, it's police officers are there to kind of police the students and surveil the students. And so it really, really, there's so many opportunities to weigh in and kind of change systems at schools.
So I didn't mention this before. My name is Anthony, and I'm a Quaker, and over the last 25 years, I've been exposed to a lot of trainings that have helped me to be a little less violent. And things like Alternatives to Violence Project, which is used a lot in our prison system, and also in places like Kenya and other places around the world where it goes into the community. I'm wondering about how these kind of programs can be integrated into our schools. There's the nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg's approach. There's compassionate listening, where people have been traumatized and learn how to listen to each other's stories without being judgmental. I mean, there's a whole panoply of training that has been successful and has worked. How do we get more of this into the schools so that students can learn alternatives to violence? The second thing I was thinking of recently with our gun buyback is a lot of times young people raise money for good causes, like they will run or walk for cancer or something else. How about if they had a fundraiser to, buy back guns from the community, something that would engage their imagination, engage their passion, and use it as an opportunity to also raise consciousness. I'm just thinking of some creative ideas that might, be able to transform the young people and their culture from a culture of violence to a culture of peace. That's great.
Well, I think we're getting the cue here, and folks are coming in, so we're going to wrap this up, and thank you, everyone here.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, so we have a couple of action items. We want to report back from the 3 different groups. We want to direct your attention to all of the wonderful resources at the table. And still have a chance for you guys to chat, all in 10 minutes. So thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Francisco. I'm on staff here at All Saints, and I work on our Peace and Justice ministries here. And thank you for being here this evening. And I was sitting in, what we'll do first is wrap up on our 3 breakout sessions, and through that process talk about some of the ideas, themes, and some concrete steps that may be emerging out of these groups. Obviously, this is a work in progress, and the task force on gun violence at All Saints will continue to take this in, and so we can keep moving into that sustained action. So we'll report on the 3 groups. Make sure you know and make use of all of these wonderful resources at the table, and then we'll close off our evening. So I was in the workshop or the breakout on advocacy and direct action, and so we had a great discussion and presentation started by Angelica from the Children's Defense Fund about her work around legislative advocacy around school reform and addressing what many people know as the school to prison pipeline, so issues of injustice and how that actually relates to issues of violence and gun violence. And then moving from that to then how do we advocate around issues, what's happening now at the national level with the the stalled legislative action in the Senate, and how now there's legislative activity in the House brewing around that may include background checks, and how do we continue to keep our eye focused and active. So we talked about some of the how-tos about letter writing and making appointments with our legislators to continue to have our voices heard. From there, we went with Patrick and Maddie gave some very concrete examples about how taking an issue such as gun violence or the need for gun reform onto the streets can be a very powerful and influential tool. Even if it's a small group of dedicated people who sustain action on an issue, progress can be made. And they gave examples of the work that they did in helping contribute to the ending of the gun show in the city of Glendale, for example, by showing up at the Glendale Gun Show and advocating and being part of a group of community activists that were going to city council meetings and speaking up. In addition to organizing on, in response to what happened at Sandy Hook, and being visibly present, in vigil, and making use of the media, and which was talked about, I think, in what Kaile said about get your story out there, change the story, make it heard. So from there, I think we really centered around schools. Seemed to be the core theme that came out of our discussion about how do we work with our schools, and specifically thinking about in the area of Pasadena, what's going on right now with respect to nonviolence education, for example, education around gun violence prevention in the schools. So there was interest in finding out what is Pasadena Unified and the surrounding schools, what are they doing right now, and how might our community help lend a voice and contribute in that effort as well, whether it's conflict resolution, education, training, continuing to be active, as at the same time that we're pushing the advocacy and the organizing, then how do we connect with our schools and with our youth around these issues? So that's what came up in our breakout. And we ran out of time. Great discussion. So I guess now I'll invite Juliana to talk about the guns and the law workshop.
All right, we had a small but mighty group, and we had a wonderful conversation with one another about guns and the law, which inevitably includes a conversation about politics, and we kept trying to stray ourselves back to the topic, but it's hard not to, because this is such a political issue as well, as we talk about our elected officials and what they're doing and what they're not doing. But we had a really extensive conversation and educated ourselves more about background checks and the background check systems, and what current proposals are actually proposing to do and what they're not doing, and how we can better have conversations with people about the merits of the law, what they actually mean. And in the end, I think that our conversation was more about the realization that we need a massive public education campaign, that so many of us are feeling outraged, but how do we equip ourselves to have conversations with people and to engage in the work? And we acknowledge that tonight is a beginning step in that, but how do we sort of replicate what's happening here and make sure that it's happening everywhere, so that when we talk about 94% of people advocating for universal background checks or the like, that we're really educating ourselves and not just responding with our hearts, that we really know the merits of the law and what these laws are going to do if they pass. And so that was our conversation. Laura.
I was with Patty and Daniel in public health, and we had a great conversation that was cut way too short with a large group, where we talked about our own concerns and what brought us here tonight, and looked at some themes around public health that included everything from the conversation of violence versus gun violence, urban versus rural, policy versus individual practice. And I encourage you to grab this two handouts that we brought down with us. One is the spectrum of prevention, and as overwhelming as it felt to feel like there are so many different ways to approach this and not one common goal and work that we are all moving towards together, there is also a lot of freedom and grace in having this many options for people to enter into this issue wherever they feel like they can do that. And so there's 6 different levels, and Patty talked about how you can come in on one level, you can come in on several levels, you can come in as an individual or as a group, you can be doing things simultaneously, and it was very empowering, I think, to hear that. The second handout Daniel gave us was about changing the conversation about violence and increasing everyone's sense of safety and security. This is about ways that we can really advocate our media
to change this story about our fear and violence and how we can start to retell that story in our own communities. It gives great strategies for how you can influence the media, both on a local level and a national level.
Great, thank you both, and thank you all for participating in those workshops and in those discussions. As we said, this is a beginning, and we have a lot of material next steps. I'm going to run through some of it. Virginia, please let me know if I leave anything critical out. So we have what we're calling a menu, which is a sheet that gives you, lays out all kinds of options of where is your heart beating fast, what are you interested in doing, how do you want to engage and enter into this action item, into this issue here in our community. So there's a range of options, and there's other for you to add something that we may have left out. So it could be anything from direct advocacy to outreach to meeting with legislative officials to telling your story if you have a personal story, if you've been impacted by gun violence or you know someone you love has been, getting that story out there. So please take a moment to fill this sheet out so we can know how to be in touch with you. Okay, they're being circulated. Great. I have a clipboard here too. At the action table, we also have a couple of things for you to sign and take action now. We have postcards about the package of state bills that are being proposed in California that will address and promote sensible gun reform in our state. We have strong laws on the books now, but we can make them even better. So there's a package that's been introduced that we're trying to help move through the legislative process. And there are also thank you letters to okay, so senators and legislative advocates who've taken the right stood on the right side of this issue. We want to thank them, and these are our local Congress people who've taken a stand on these issues, and we want to thank them and let them know to keep up the good work, and we're going to continue to call on them to step out in front on these issues. So take a moment. If you're a of Schiff, Chu, or Becerra are your representatives, please come up and sign that letter. And then we have a wealth of resources and at the table for you to grab and take with you. Anything crucial that I left out? Okay, so those are all the materials. Please make them available to you. And anything else? Okay, I think so I want to acknowledge the work of the All Saints Task Force on Gun Violence, our crew here. So Dennis Hernandez, our chair. Linda McGarian, who's a committee member. Virginia Classic, another committee member. Other folks who weren't present here. And all of our presenters, I want to thank you all for your contributions tonight and helping make this a really powerful night. We know that Margaret Mead, who was an Episcopalian actually, is famously known for saying that never underestimate that a small group of people can do wonderful, I'm paraphrasing, incredible things. Do extraordinary things, and that is our task here, is to call all of us to action and to engage our fellow parishioners, fellow neighbors, fellow people out in the community onto these issues. And with that, brother. Absolutely, and I think with that, 90% of the population clearly then it runs across the spectrum of belief and theological background, that the vast majority of people from all faiths and no faith are on the side of this issue, so that we need to push and do everything we can to make this happen. So with that, let us close in a prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this evening, for this time together, to come together to hear your prophetic voices in our community in response
and a challenge to gun violence. We ask that you send us out into our communities, into our parishes, on fire, ready to unleash with this powerful witness, to share this story, to continue to do your good work, to promote justice, peace, love, compassion, to pass gun reform now, to make our communities safer, to fight for our youth, and to be witnesses of your love in the here and now. These things we pray in the name of all that is holy. God's name. Amen. Amen. Thank you and good night.